There's an old saying that the truth leaves traces, like footprints in sand. But what happens when those traces start disappearing, one by one, until even the footprints themselves are gone? When not just the person vanishes, but the very proof they ever existed begins to fade away like morning mist. This is about something far more unsettling than a simple missing person case. This is about an entire town that seems to have been erased from existence, leaving behind only whispers in old newspaper archives and the growing obsession of one journalist who stumbled upon something that perhaps was never meant to be found. I'm talking about a place that appeared in census records, had a post office, sent men to war, celebrated holidays, buried their dead in marked graves, and then, piece by piece, all evidence of its existence began to vanish. Not destroyed, not lost to fire or flood, but methodically erased as if someone was carefully editing reality itself. The journalist's name was Sarah Mitchell, and she worked for a small regional newspaper in Pennsylvania. She wasn't particularly ambitious, wasn't chasing Pulitzer Prizes or breaking major stories. She covered local council meetings, high school football games, church bazaars, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that keeps small communities informed about themselves. It started with what should have been a routine assignment. The newspaper's editor wanted to run a series about forgotten towns in the region, the kind of places that had thrived during the coal mining boom, and then slowly faded when the mines closed. Sarah was tasked with researching these ghost towns, finding old photographs, maybe interviewing elderly residents who remembered better times. She began her research at the County Historical Society, poring over dusty archives and brittle newspapers from the 1920s and 1930s. Most of the towns she researched followed predictable patterns: boom, decline, abandonment. The stories were sad but familiar. Mining companies pulled out, young people left for cities, buildings crumbled, nature reclaimed what man had built. But then she found something odd. In a newspaper from 1934, there was a mention of a town called Millbrook Valley. The article was brief, just a few lines about the town's annual harvest festival. Nothing remarkable about that, except when Sarah tried to find more information about Millbrook Valley. She couldn't locate it anywhere else. She checked modern maps, historical maps, census records. Nothing. She searched through other newspapers from the same period, thinking maybe the name had been misspelled or she had misread it, but there it was, clear as day. Millbrook Valley, population 847, celebrating their 19th annual harvest festival. A town of nearly 800 people doesn't just disappear without a trace. There should be records, photographs, descendants who remembered grandparents talking about the old days. There should be ruins, foundations, at least a cemetery. But Sarah found nothing. Intrigued now, she expanded her search. She drove to the area where, based on the newspaper's description, Millbrook Valley should have been located. The article mentioned it was 12 miles north of Carbondale, nestled in a valley between two ridges. Sarah knew the area well, had driven through it countless times. It was empty woodland, state forest land, that looked like it had been undisturbed for decades. But as she walked through the woods, something felt wrong. The trees were mature, yes, but they weren't ancient. And there were subtle signs, if you knew how to look. Slight depressions in the ground that might have been foundations. A few scattered bricks, so old and weathered they crumbled when touched. And strangest of all, she found a section of the forest where the trees grew in unnaturally straight lines, as if they had been planted to follow the pattern of old streets. Sarah returned to the Historical Society with renewed determination. She requested every newspaper from 1930 to 1940, searching methodically through each issue. And slowly, she began to find more mentions of Millbrook Valley. A wedding announcement in 1932, a brief item about a fire at the local school in 1935, an obituary for a World War I veteran in 1937. Each mention was small, inconsequential, the kind of local news that filled the back pages of small-town newspapers. But here's where it gets truly strange. Sarah made copies of every article she found, carefully documenting the dates and page numbers. She created a timeline, mapping out the life of this forgotten town. And then, when she returned to the Historical Society a week later to continue her research, some of the articles were gone. Not the entire newspapers, just the articles about Millbrook Valley. The wedding announcement had been carefully cut out, leaving a rectangular hole in the page. The obituary had been removed so precisely that the surrounding text remained intact. It was as if someone had followed behind her, systematically erasing the evidence she had discovered. Sarah confronted the Historical Society's librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had worked there for 30 years. Mrs. Henderson seemed genuinely confused. She had no record of anyone else requesting those particular newspapers. The building was kept locked, and only she and 2 other staff members had keys. She suggested that perhaps the articles had been damaged by time. That old newspaper had a way of falling apart. But Sarah had seen the cuts. They were clean, precise, made with a sharp blade. This wasn't natural deterioration. Someone was deliberately removing every trace of Millbrook Valley from the historical record. That night, Sarah spread out her copies on her kitchen table and studied them carefully. The articles painted a picture of a typical small town. People got married, died, celebrated holidays, worried about their children. There were mentions of local businesses, a general store, a church, a one-room schoolhouse, the kind of place that should have left behind a mountain of evidence, not just a few scattered newspaper clippings. She decided to try a different approach. Instead of looking for direct mentions of Millbrook Valley, she searched for the people mentioned in the articles. The wedding announcement, for instance, described the marriage of Helen Kowalski to James Murphy. Sarah searched for birth records, death certificates, military service records. Nothing. It was as if Helen Kowalski and James Murphy had never existed. The obituary mentioned a veteran named Thomas Brennan, who had served in France during World War I. Sarah contacted the National Archives, the Veterans Administration, military historians. There was no record of Thomas Brennan from Millbrook Valley. No record of Thomas Brennan from that county at all. One by one, Sarah traced every name mentioned in the articles. 37 people in total: teachers, shopkeepers, farmers, children. Not one of them appeared in any official record. No birth certificates, no death certificates, no census entries, no military records, no school enrollment, no marriage licenses. It was as if they had all been fictional characters in some elaborate hoax. But why would someone create fictional news stories about a non-existent town? And why would someone now be going to such lengths to erase even those fictional traces? Sarah began to notice other oddities. The articles about Millbrook Valley were always written in the same style, with the same subtle peculiarities of grammar and phrasing. They were always placed in the same section of the newspaper, always in the lower right corner of page 7, and they always appeared in newspapers published on Wednesdays. More disturbing, Sarah realized that her own copies were beginning to change. Words were fading, becoming illegible. The paper itself seemed to be aging rapidly, becoming brittle and yellow. She had made photocopies of the photocopies, but even those were deteriorating. It was as if the very act of documenting Millbrook Valley was somehow causing the evidence to self-destruct. Sarah's editor began to worry about her. She had been working on the Ghost Town series for 2 months, and she had yet to submit a single article. When he asked about her progress, she tried to explain about Millbrook Valley, but her words sounded crazy even to herself. A town that existed only in newspaper articles, that were disappearing as she studied them. People who had never been born writing letters to the editor about community events that had never happened. But Sarah couldn't let it go. She had stumbled onto something, some kind of mystery that seemed to reach beyond the normal boundaries of journalism. She began to expand her research, looking for similar cases in other regions, and slowly she began to find them. A town called Cedar Springs in Oregon, mentioned in a few newspaper articles from the 1940s, but absent from all official records. A place called Harmony Mills in Vermont, briefly referenced in a 1950s travel guide, but impossible to locate on any map. Always the same pattern. Brief mentions in local newspapers, no official records, and evidence that seemed to disappear as soon as someone began to investigate. Sarah created a map, marking the locations of these phantom towns. There were dozens of them, scattered across the country. Some were mentioned only once or twice. Others had left behind slightly more extensive paper trails. But all of them shared the same characteristics. They had existed briefly in the margins of recorded history, and then vanished so completely that even their disappearance had been forgotten. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Someone, or some organization, had been creating these fictional towns for decades. But why? What was the purpose of populating newspapers with stories about places that didn't exist and people who had never lived? Sarah began to research the newspapers themselves. The publications that had carried stories about the phantom towns were all small, local papers with limited circulation. Most had been family-owned operations, passed down through generations. Many had struggled financially, barely surviving from year to year. The kind of papers that might be willing to accept unusual content if the price was right. She managed to track down the son of a newspaper editor from the 1940s. The man was in his 80s, living in a nursing home in Ohio. His father had owned a small weekly paper that had carried several articles about Cedar Springs. When Sarah asked about it, the old man's eyes became distant, as if he were trying to remember something from long ago. "My father used to get these stories," he said slowly. "They'd come in the mail, typed up neat and proper, with a $20 bill attached. That was good money in those days. The stories were harmless enough, just local news about some little town up in the mountains. My father figured they were legitimate. Why would someone make up stories about church socials and school board meetings?" But the old man remembered something else. His father had tried to visit Cedar Springs once, just out of curiosity. He had driven up into the mountains, following the directions that had been included with one of the stories. But he had never found the town. When he returned home, he had seemed troubled, different somehow. He had stopped accepting the stories after that, even though the money would have been helpful. Sarah realized she was dealing with something far more complex than a simple hoax. The phantom towns weren't random creations. They were part of some larger pattern, some purpose that she couldn't yet understand, and someone was still actively working to keep that purpose hidden, still removing evidence, still erasing traces. She began to feel watched, cars that seemed to follow her when she drove to interview sources, phone calls that ended in silence when she answered. Her apartment was broken into, but nothing was stolen, just her research materials, carefully searched through and then left in slightly different positions. The message was clear. She was getting close to something that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden, and that someone had resources, organization, and a reach that extended far beyond what any individual could manage. Sarah realized that she had stumbled into something much larger than a simple historical mystery. The phantom towns weren't just curiosities from the past. They were part of something ongoing, something that was still happening. And the evidence was disappearing because the people behind it were still out there, still working to maintain their secret. But what was that secret? What was the purpose of creating towns that existed only on paper? And why was someone willing to go to such lengths to erase even the fictional traces of these fictional places? The answers, Sarah was beginning to realize, might be more disturbing than the mystery itself. Because if someone could make an entire town disappear from history, what else might they be capable of erasing? And if they were still active, still working to maintain their secret, what would they do to someone who had discovered too much? As Sarah sat in her apartment, surrounded by her dwindling collection of evidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer just researching a story. She was being researched herself, studied, evaluated, and somewhere in the shadows, decisions were being made about what to do with the journalist who had asked too many questions about places that were never supposed to be found. The town that vanished from the map wasn't just Millbrook Valley. It was part of a network, a system of phantom places that existed in the spaces between reality and record. And Sarah Mitchell, small-town journalist, had become the next person who might need to disappear, leaving behind only the faintest traces of her investigation into something that was never meant to be discovered. The evidence continued to fade. The photocopies continued to deteriorate. And Sarah began to wonder if she herself might be next to vanish, becoming just another person who had asked the wrong questions about the wrong places and learned too much about the careful editing of reality itself.